Carlos Salinas de Gortari never killed anyone with his own hands, but the first death caused by his last name happened when he was 3 years old, and he was in the same room. A 12-year-old girl, a 22 caliber rifle, a door locked from the inside in the National Palace, and two children holding the gun. When the staff broke the door down, Manuela was already dead, and Carlos was staring at the body. That was his first cover-up. He was 3. 15 minutes later, his father decided no one would ever speak about it again. 50,000 pesos to the family, the file classified, the case closed, and a message burned into the minds of 2 boys. In the Salinas family, the truth gets buried, mistakes get hidden, and people are disposable. For Raúl, that lesson would turn him into the man who ordered a murder. For Carlos, it would turn him into the president of Mexico. And listen to this, because it's not a rumor, it's not fiction, it's not political gossip. It's a real recording, hidden for years, made by a journalist in 2010. The voice sounds tense, cracked, vengeful. Carlos knew everything, every move, every account, every transfer. I wasn't acting alone. He coordinated, I executed, and when everything went wrong, he cut my hands off and left me alone. That's not an enemy speaking. That's his brother, the man who carried the trash, the secrets, the favors, the dirty money. The man who spent 10 years in prison while Carlos slept peacefully. And here comes the worst part. Manuela's death wasn't an accident. The fraud of '88 wasn't a technical error. The murder of his brother-in-law wasn't an isolated event. And when Nex IVM collapsed and one of his sons fell with it, that wasn't a coincidence either. Everything is part of the same curse. A curse that begins in a room full of blood and falls on 3 entire generations. Today I'm going to tell you how a last name built unlimited power and completely destroyed the children who inherited it. Because this isn't the story of a president. It's the story of a father who sacrificed his family to protect his kingdom. And the most running on some part is this. To this day, none of his children want to carry his last name, but none of them can escape it. But there is a file. Just 3 typed pages archived in the basements of the prosecutor's office. In 1995, during the investigations into Raúl Salinas, an official named Roberto Hernandez found that file by accident. Hernandez made copies, kept them at home, and when he tried to hand them to journalists, 2 men came to his house and told him, word for word, "Those pages do not exist, and if you insist they exist, you won't exist either." Hernandez destroyed the copies, resigned from the prosecutor's office, moved to the United States. But before leaving, he told his brother what he had read in those 3 pages. The file said the bullet wound on Manuela was inconsistent with an accidental discharge. The angle suggested the rifle was aimed deliberately. And there were statements from 2 palace employees who said they heard Manuela screaming minutes before the shot. Screaming words like, "No, please, no." Hold on to that detail because what a 5-year-old boy witnessed in that room would define everything Raúl Salinas would do 43 years later. But first you need to understand who the father was, because everything that comes next, all the corruption, all the betrayal, all the pain, begins with how Carlos Salinas Lozano raised his sons. Carlos Salinas Lozano wasn't an ordinary politician. He was a Harvard-trained economist with international connections that made him indispensable to the PRI. A brilliant man who understood that in 1950s Mexico, power wasn't conquered with ideals. It was conquered with absolute loyalty to the system and the efficient elimination of obstacles. Manuela's death was just the first obstacle eliminated. After 1951, his career rose without friction. Senator, Undersecretary of Industry and Commerce, Director of multiple state companies, each position more powerful than the last. And as he climbed, he taught his sons exactly how to apply that philosophy. The rules were clear. Rule number 1, the last name matters more than the individual. Failing as a Salinas is unforgivable because it stains everyone. Rule number 2, power justifies any method. Morality and ethics are concepts for people who don't have the courage to do what's necessary. Rule number 3, loyalty to power outranks loyalty to blood. If someone in the family becomes a weakness, they are removed from the equation. Those rules weren't taught with speeches, they were taught with coldness, with silence, with a total absence of affection. There's a testimony from Margarita de Gortari, the wife of Carlos Salinas Lozano. It was shared in 1989 with a distant cousin during a family dinner. The cousin remembered it years later in an interview with the newspaper Proceso. Margarita said, "Carlos never hugged our children, not once. When Raúl had chickenpox at 7 and cried from the pain, Carlos walked into his room and said, 'Salinas men don't cry. Control yourself.' Raúl stopped crying, but something broke in his eyes that day. And here's the question that defines this entire story. What happens inside the mind of a child who learns that pain must be hidden, that vulnerability is shame, that his father's love is conditional on performance? The answer is in what Raúl and Carlos became. Carlos Salinas de Gortari was born to be president. He was told as a child that it was his prophecy and he would fulfill it no matter the cost. But to reach the presidency, he would need his brother Raúl to do the dirty work no president can do in public. And Raúl was willing, because Raúl never forgot the lesson of 1951. Problems get eliminated. People are disposable. And if you have the right power, there are never consequences. Carlos Salinas de Gortari was born on April 3, 1948. From the moment he could remember, he was told that one day he would be president of Mexico. It wasn't a possibility. It was a prophecy that had to come true. Carlos grew up as a strange child, serious beyond his years, observant, calculating. In family photographs, he's always slightly apart from the others, with a neutral expression, eyes showing no visible emotion. He didn't have real friends. He had functional contacts. The U.S. ambassador's son to practice English, the finance minister's son to understand money, the labor leader's son to learn the mechanics of working-class power. At 12, he was reading advanced economics. At 15, he was attending political meetings with his father, taking mental notes of every name, every promise, every favor owed. His father watched him with cold approval. Raúl, the older brother, watched him with something more complicated admiration mixed with resentment, because Raúl was different. Raúl was impulsive where Carlos was calculating. Raúl showed emotion where Carlos showed control. Raúl needed approval where Carlos simply executed expectations. And Raúl never forgot what he saw in that room in 1951. Manuela's body, the blood, the rifle, and above all, his father's expression when he entered. Not horror, not sadness, a cold evaluation of how to manage the problem. Raúl learned the most important lesson of his life that day. Problems get eliminated. People are disposable. And if you have the right power, there are never consequences. Carlos studied economics at the National University, graduating with honors. Then he went to Harvard for his doctorate. In 1971, he returned to Mexico and began his unstoppable ascent. Analyst, deputy director, director, undersecretary. Every promotion was calculated. Carlos never asked for favors directly. He positioned himself where opportunities would appear inevitably. He eliminated competitors without direct confrontation, becoming indispensable while others made visible mistakes. In 1982, at 34, Carlos Salinas was named Secretary of Programming and Budget, the most powerful position in the cabinet after the presidency itself. He controlled every peso of the federal budget. From that post, he began building his political machine for the presidency. But while Carlos built legitimate power, Raúl began building his own empire in the shadows. Raúl never got Carlos's credentials. No doctorate, no publications, no intellectual shine that opened doors in formal politics. But Raúl had something Carlos desperately needed, the willingness to get his hands dirty in deals Carlos needed to happen, but could never execute personally. And this is where the story becomes truly dark, because there is a document, one the Mexican government classified for 8 years, a document that mentions Raúl Salinas and one of the most dangerous drug traffickers in Mexico on the same page. In 1985, Raúl officially worked as a low-level bureaucrat in the Ministry of Commerce. His official salary was 180,000 pesos a year, about nan per year. Unofficially, Raúl was already building a network that included businessmen with ties to drug trafficking, politicians willing to ignore irregularities, and financial operators who knew how to move money without leaving traces. There is a CISIN intelligence document dated March 1987, a routine report on individuals of interest in circles of power. Raúl Salinas appears on page 14. It says, Raúl Salinas de Gortari maintains frequent contact with Juan Garcia Abrego and associates of the Gulf Cartel. Exact nature of relationship unknown. Recommendation, continuous monitoring without direct action due to sensitive family connections. That document was classified. It stayed hidden for 8 years. And when it was finally leaked in 1995, the government dismissed it as speculation without conclusive evidence. But conclusive evidence existed. There is a photograph taken by DEA agents in March in Cancun. In it, you see Juan Garcia Abrego, leader of the Gulf Cartel, hugging another man. They're smiling. Whiskey bottles on the table. The other man is Raúl Salinas de Gortari, the brother of the president of Mexico. The photo was sent to Washington. It was included in intelligence reports. It was shared with high-level U.S. officials. But it was never presented publicly, never admitted as evidence. Why? Because Carlos Salinas was negotiating NAFTA with the United States. The U.S. government needed Carlos to succeed because NAFTA was a geopolitical priority. Revealing that the Mexican president's brother was being photographed with drug traffickers would have destroyed the treaty. So the photo was classified, kept secret, and NAFTA was signed with bilateral celebrations. But that photograph isn't even the most shocking part. The most shocking part is what a DEA agent revealed years later in an anonymous interview. Something that answered the question everyone asked. Did Carlos know what Raúl was doing? Wait for this, because what comes next changes the official narrative completely. But before we get to that, you need to understand how Carlos reached the presidency, because that moment was when Mexico lost its last chance to stop what was coming. Mexico was facing a brutal economic crisis, inflation over 150%, unpayable foreign debt, growing social unrest. The PRI faced its first real threat of losing power. Carlos Salinas was chosen as presidential candidate in October 1987. His main opponent was Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, son of the legendary president Lázaro Cárdenas. The campaign was brutal. Salinas promised modernization. Cárdenas promised social justice. The polls showed an extremely tight race. On July 6, 1988, Mexico voted. Early results showed a clear lead for Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. At 8 p.m., with 30% of polling stations reported, Cárdenas had 42% versus Salinas's 35%. And then, at 8:47 p.m., the electoral computer system went down. Manuel Bartlett, Secretary of the Interior, appeared on national television. The system is experiencing temporary technical failures. We ask for patience while they are resolved. The system stayed down for 3 hours and 20 minutes. When it came back after midnight, the results had changed dramatically. Carlos Salinas now led with 50.4%. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas had dropped to 31%. Mathematically, it was impossible. For the numbers to swing like that, the remaining 70% of polling stations would have needed to vote for Salinas by margins of 70-30 or higher. In a close election, those numbers don't happen naturally. Cárdenas denounced fraud immediately. He organized massive protests. Hundreds of thousands filled the Zócalo demanding transparency. The PRI refused. The electoral tally sheets were never audited. 2 years later, they were accidentally incinerated. But in 2004, a man called into a radio program in Mexico City. He identified himself as Carlos Manuel López, a former engineer of the 1988 electoral computing system. For 23 minutes live on air, López said he personally received orders to modify the counting algorithms, that the system crash was deliberate, that backup data existed showing Cárdenas had won. He gave technical specifics, server names, access codes, the names of officials in the computing room that night. And then López disappeared. 3 months later, Carlos Manuel López's body was found in a ravine near Cuernavaca. Official cause, a car accident. But the car had impact marks on the rear consistent with being pushed. The autopsy showed bruising to the head that occurred before the crash. The brakes had been tampered with. There was never a serious investigation. The case was closed as an accident. Carlos Salinas reached the presidency through documented electoral fraud. And that original sin poisoned his entire term. Because a man who steals a presidency has no moral limits. And a man with no moral limits cannot control a brother who operates with no legal limits. And now that you understand how Carlos came to power, I can tell you what that DEA agent confessed years later. One of those agents, identified only as Agent 47 in a 2006 interview with journalist Annabel Hernandez, said word for word, "We had clear photographic evidence that Raúl Salinas had a direct relationship with Garcia Abrego. We were ordered not to do anything with that evidence. The order came from Washington, and the reason was obvious. We couldn't destroy the president of Mexico while we were negotiating the most important trade treaty of the decade. So did Carlos know what Raúl was doing? It's impossible that he didn't. The brothers met regularly. Raúl had direct access to Los Pinos, the presidential residence. Raúl's fortune wasn't a secret inside the family, but Carlos never investigated, never asked, never intervened. Why? Because Raúl was useful. Raúl handled relationships Carlos couldn't handle officially. Raúl collected debts Carlos couldn't collect directly. Raúl eliminated problems Carlos needed eliminated without getting his own hands dirty. It was the same dynamic they learned as children in 1951. One executes, the other keeps distance. Both benefit. No one talks. But the system had a crack, and when that crack opened, Raúl did something so brutal, so ruthless, that it finally showed the world what kind of monsters the father's three rules had created. That crack had a name: José Francisco Ruiz, Monsieur Carlos Salinas' brother-in-law. A man who started asking uncomfortable questions. A man who had to die. Ruiz Massieu was Secretary General of the PRI. He was also Carlos Salinas' brother-in-law, married to his sister Adriana. He was brilliant, ambitious, and he was accumulating too much independent power inside the party. In September 1994, Ruiz Massieu began asking uncomfortable questions about irregular government contracts. He was investigating connections between PRI officials and criminal organizations, and his investigation was getting dangerously close to Raúl. On September 28, 1994, José Francisco Ruiz Massieu walked out of a political breakfast at the Camino Real Hotel in Mexico City. It was 9:17 in the morning. He was heading toward his vehicle when a man ran up to him, pulled a .38 caliber pistol, and fired 4 point-blank shots. Ruiz Massieu hit the ground. His bodyguards caught the shooter before he could escape. His name was Daniel Aguilar Trevino. Ruiz Massieu was rushed to the hospital. He died in surgery. Under interrogation, Daniel Aguilar confessed quickly. He said he'd been paid €1 and given specific orders to kill Ruiz Massieu. The orders came from Manuel Muñoz Rocha, a PRI federal deputy and a close political associate of Raúl Salinas. Federal police moved immediately to arrest Muñoz Rocha. He was gone. His house was empty. His office was clean. His bank accounts had been drained the day before the murder. Muñoz Rocha was never found alive. Why would Raúl want to kill his brother's brother-in-law, the Secretary General of the PRI? The answer is in what Ruiz Massieu was investigating. He had documents showing money transfers between shell companies controlled by Raúl and PRI officials who had facilitated fraudulent government contracts. Ruiz Massieu was building a case, and if that case became public, it wouldn't just destroy Raúl, it would destroy Carlos. It would destroy the PRI. So Ruiz Massieu had to die, and Raúl was the one who ordered it. Because in the Salinas family, protecting power always came before any other loyalty, even family loyalty. Carlos Salinas left the presidency on December 1, 1994. His successor was Ernesto Zedillo, also from the PRI. But 22 days after Zedillo took office, Mexico entered the worst economic crisis of its modern history. The peso collapsed, dropping from 3 pesos and 50 centavos per dollar to 7 pesos and 50 in a matter of weeks. Banks panicked. The stock market fell 50%. Millions of Mexicans lost their savings, their homes, their jobs. Carlos Salinas' economic legacy collapsed in less than a month. In January 1995, Zedillo's new government opened investigations into the previous administration, not out of justice, but out of political survival. Zedillo needed a scapegoat. The investigations uncovered Raúl's Swiss accounts. They uncovered the multi-million-dollar transfers. They uncovered the network of shell companies, and they uncovered the connection to Ruiz Massieu's murder. On February 28, 1995, agents from the Attorney General's office arrested Raúl Salinas at his home in Mexico City. The formal charge: mastermind behind the assassination of José Francisco Ruiz Massieu. Carlos Salinas was at home when he got the news. According to employees who were there that morning, Carlos hung up the phone, stayed silent for 30 seconds, and then said just one sentence. It was inevitable. He didn't call Raúl. He didn't immediately speak to lawyers. He didn't issue a statement defending his brother, because Carlos Salinas knew something Raúl was about to learn in the most brutal way. In Mexico's power game, nobody is indispensable. And when you fall alone. Raúl's arrest triggered a media frenzy. Journalists discovered he had 14 bank accounts in Switzerland under false names. They discovered he had transferred more than $120 million into those accounts between 1992 and 1994. Swiss authorities froze the accounts and found something extraordinary: detailed records of every transfer, every deposit, every movement. One record was especially devastating. It was an internal memo from Credit Suisse dated October 1993. The memo documented a conversation between Raúl Salinas and his banker, Antonio Caraldi. According to the memo, Caraldi asked Raúl about the origin of the funds, because the amounts were so large they triggered due diligence protocols. Raúl's answer, quoted word for word in the memo, was, "This money comes from political protection services for organizations operating in cross-border trade. My family position allows me to provide guarantees others cannot." Cross-border trade was the banker's euphemism for drug trafficking. That memo was discovered by Swiss investigators in 1996. It was shared with Mexican authorities, but it was never formally admitted as evidence in Raúl's trial because the chain of custody didn't meet Mexican legal standards. While Raúl faced criminal charges, Carlos tried to control the political disaster. On March 10, 1995, Carlos Salinas began a hunger strike in the home of a friend in Monterrey. He invited the media and declared he was the victim of political persecution orchestrated by Zedillo. It was a pathetic spectacle, an ex-president reduced to desperate theater. It didn't work. The hunger strike lasted 4 days. On March 14th, Carlos ended it, humiliated and defeated. 2 days later, he boarded a flight to the United States. He would never again live permanently in Mexico. Over the next 2 years, Carlos lived in voluntary exile, first in the U.S., then Canada, then Ireland. During that time, he wrote a 100-page book titled Mexico, A Difficult Step Toward Modernity. It's a massive exercise in self-justification. Carlos casts himself as a misunderstood visionary, a brave reformer attacked by reactionary forces. The book mentions Raúl exactly 3 times. And in none of those mentions does Carlos claim to believe his brother is innocent. Not a word of support, not a sentence defending him, not even the basic decency of public family loyalty, because Carlos had done the calculation. Raúl was a liability. Defending Raúl meant sinking with him. Raúl spent 10 years in a maximum security prison. He was eventually acquitted of Ruiz Massieu's murder in 2005, but he was convicted of illicit enrichment and money laundering. He was released in 2008. During those 10 years, Carlos never visited him in prison, not once. In 2008, when Raúl got out, the brothers saw each other briefly at a private family event. According to witnesses, they greeted each other with a cold handshake. No hug, no meaningful conversation. But there is a recording, the audio I mentioned at the beginning, the 47 minutes where Raúl talks about his brother. That recording was made in 2010 by journalist Jorge Fernandez Menendez during an interview for a book that was never published. In it, Raúl expands on what he confessed earlier. He explains how the dynamic worked since they were kids in the National Palace. How Carlos was always the brain, while he was the hands, and how he was abandoned when everything collapsed. Later in the conversation, Raúl says something even more devastating. "Do you know what the saddest part is? I would have done the same thing, because that's how we were raised. In our family, love was never unconditional. Love was something you earned by being useful. And when you stop being useful, you stop being loved." We both learned that lesson on the same day in 1951. The only difference is, I learned it with blood on my hands, and he learned it by watching. That recording explains everything. It explains the power dynamic between the brothers. It explains why Carlos never intervened. It explains why Raúl operated with impunity. It explains how 2 boys who witnessed a violent death and a cover-up became adults capable of betraying any principle for power. But the Salinas curse didn't end with Carlos and Raúl. It passed to the next generation, and in some ways, it was even worse. Carlos Salinas and Cecilia Ocelli had 5 children: Cecilia, Emiliano, Carlos, Ana Emilia, and Patricio. During the presidential term, those kids grew up in Los Pinos, surrounded by absolute privilege and conditional love. Hector Maldonado, one of the bodyguards assigned to the family during the administration, gave an interview in 2006. The children could go 3 or 4 days without seeing their father. When they did see him, it was in formal settings. I never saw the president hug his kids. Never. Maldonado remembered a specific incident from 1991. Emiliano, the oldest son, was 14. He had failed a math exam. He was crying in his room. The president walked in, not to comfort him, but to tell him Salinas men don't fail, that he had disappointed the family. Emiliano stopped crying instantly, but I saw something change in his eyes, like a light went out. Emiliano Salinas Ocelli, the oldest son, internalized the paternal model. Brilliant, ambitious, emotionally controlled. He studied at Harvard Business School like his father. In 2004, Emiliano was invited to a personal development seminar in Albany, New York. It was run by an organization called Executive Success Programs. The leader was a man named Keith Raniere. Raniere was charismatic, intellectually polished, and he promised exactly what Emiliano needed: a methodology to eliminate emotional limitations and achieve success without restrictions. Emiliano was fascinated, and in 2006 he became the leader of that organization in Mexico, rebranded as NextVM. For the next 11 years, Emiliano was the public face of NextVM in Mexico and Latin America. He organized massive events that attracted hundreds of people. He recruited business people, actresses, politicians. NextVM promised personal growth, but in reality it was a cult, a psychological manipulation operation designed to enrich and empower Keith Raniere. And inside NextVM, there was something even darker: DOS. DOS was a secret society within NextVM women only. Members were recruited with the promise of joining a sisterhood of warriors, but the reality was sexual slavery wrapped in the language of empowerment. Women in DOS were branded with hot irons. The brands were Keith Raniere's initials. They were forced to provide collateral compromising photos, confessions of devastating secrets used as blackmail if they tried to leave. They were psychologically manipulated into sexual service to Raniere. They were put on extreme diets of 500 calories a day. They were isolated from their families and friends outside NextVM. Did Emiliano know about DOS? Emiliano has always denied direct knowledge. He says DOS was an internal subgroup he wasn't part of, but survivor testimonies tell a different story. Sarah Edmondson, one of the women who escaped DOS and became a key witness, said in 2018 that Emiliano was present at multiple events where DOS members were there and showed obvious signs of abuse, extreme weight loss, fearful behavior, total submission. Tony Natalie, Raniere's former partner who escaped NextVM years earlier, said in a 2019 interview, Emiliano wasn't naive. He was smart, observant, educated. He saw what was happening. He chose not to see it because NextVM gave him something he never had: a family that celebrated him, a leader who affirmed him, a purpose that filled the emptiness his father left. And because of that desperate need to belong, he became complicit in the abuse of dozens of women. In March 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested in Mexico by the FBI. He was charged with sex trafficking, forced labor, extortion, and criminal conspiracy. Emiliano resigned from NextVM 2 days after the arrest. He published a statement: "I had no knowledge of criminal activities. I was deceived like many others. I offer sincere apologies to anyone who was harmed." But he never gave long interviews. He never explained specifically what he knew and when. He never acknowledged responsibility beyond being deceived. In 2019, Keith Raniere was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Emiliano was never charged criminally. And Carlos Salinas? What did the father say about his son's scandal? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Carlos never made a public statement about NextVM. He never defended Emiliano publicly. He never expressed paternal support or solidarity, because in the Salinas family, acknowledging one member's mistake is admitting collective weakness, and weakness is still unforgivable. The other Salinas Ocelli children chose different paths, all shaped by the trauma of growing up as the children of the most hated ex-president in Mexico. Carlos Salinas Ocelli, the third child, moved completely away from the country. He's lived in Madrid since 2010. In a rare 2015 interview with a Spanish newspaper, he said, "My father is brilliant and my father is complicated. I love my family, but I can't live in Mexico. The last name weighs too much." Ana Emilia Salinas, the fourth child, stayed in Mexico and became a social activist. She founded a nonprofit that supports women who are victims of domestic violence. In a 2016 interview, Ana Emilia said something revealing. "I chose to work with women who survive powerful men because I understand that dynamic better than anyone. I understand what it is to live under the control of someone who has all the power and no empathy." She didn't name names. She didn't have to. Patricio Salinas, the youngest, keeps the lowest profile of all. He studied architecture at Columbia University. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. No social media presence. And then there's Cecilia Salinas Ocelli, the oldest daughter. Cecilia was 18 when her father left office, 19 when her uncle Raúl was arrested, 20 when her father fled Mexico. She saw everything: the fall, the humiliation, the family breaking apart. In 2002, Cecilia married a low-profile businessman. The wedding was private, almost secret, fewer than 50 guests. Carlos Salinas attended, but he didn't give the traditional father's speech. He left before the reception ended. But in 2015, during the funeral of Margarita de Gortari, Cecilia's maternal grandmother, something exposed the family's truth. Cecilia was sitting on a side pew in the church. Her father, Carlos, was at the front with his characteristic neutral expression. During the service, Cecilia began to cry, not silently, audibly. Her father didn't move. He didn't turn. He didn't come over to comfort her. A society photographer captured that moment. Cecilia crying alone. Her father 20 meters away, unmoving. Carlos Salinas Lozano, the man who started it all, the senator who covered up Manuela's death in 1951, suffered a massive stroke in 2004. He was paralyzed on the right side. He lost the ability to speak clearly. His last 5 years were spent in a wheelchair in a house in Cuernavaca, cared for by nurses. His children visited occasionally. Carlos, the ex-president, went once a month. He stayed 30 minutes. He never stayed for a meal. Raúl, newly out of prison, never visited him. In September 2009, weeks before he died, Carlos Salinas Lozano asked one of his nurses to help him write a letter. His left hand trembled violently, but he insisted on signing it himself. The letter was 3 handwritten pages in uneven, shaky script. It was addressed to my children. The exact contents were never published, but according to 2 people close to the family who saw the document, it was devastating. Carlos Salinas Lozano expressed regret for a parenting model built on ambition over affection. He admitted he raised his children to conquer, but not to love. He acknowledged he passed down a philosophy where showing emotion was weakness. The letter included a specific section about the 1951 incident. Salinas Lozano admitted the shot hadn't been completely accidental, that there were elements never properly investigated, and that the first cover-up established a pattern that defined everything that came after. The letter ended with a line the nurse remembered exactly, because Salinas Lozano made her write it and rewrite it 3 times until it was perfect. "I taught you how to conquer the world. I forgot to teach you how to love one another. And now I die knowing I stole from you the only thing that matters." Carlos Salinas Lozano died on October 14, 2009, at 93. The funeral was private. The media were not invited. Today, in 2025, Carlos Salinas de Gortari is 77 years old. He lives between Mexico and Ireland. He occasionally publishes opinion pieces about the economy, gives the occasional virtual lecture, never mentions his brother Raúl, and rarely mentions his children. In 2023, Carlos gave a rare interview to The Economist. They asked about his legacy. He answered with economic statistics. They asked about his family. He said, "My family's fine. Each one has found their path." He didn't elaborate. No details, no emotion. Because Carlos Salinas de Gortari, at 77, is still exactly what he has always been. A brilliant, ambitious man who is emotionally incapable of connecting with the human beings he should love. Raúl Salinas de Gortari is 79. He lives in Mexico City in a modest house. He avoids the media. He has no public profile. His ex-wife divorced him in 2007. His adult children legally changed their last names to remove Salinas. They don't keep regular contact with him. The Salinas brothers don't speak. They haven't seen each other in person since 2010 at their mother's funeral. When they crossed paths at that event, they greeted each other with a cold handshake and stayed on opposite sides of the church. There is no reconciliation possible, because to reconcile, you'd have to admit mistakes, show vulnerability, acknowledge pain. And the Salinas were raised to never do any of those things. Emiliano Salinas is 52. He still lives in Mexico, running an ethical leadership consulting company. The irony isn't lost on anyone. NEVIEM survivors mention him frequently on social media as someone who never fully faced accountability. His name is toxic in progressive circles. The other Salinas Uccelli children live scattered geographically and emotionally. They get together maybe once every 2 years for obligatory family events. When they're together, the tension is palpable. Superficial conversations, zero emotional depth. None of them has a close relationship with their father. Occasional courtesy phone calls, obligatory Christmas visits, but no real intimacy. In 2018, a journalist asked Carlos Salinas what he regrets most in life. Carlos answered without hesitation: economic decisions that weren't fully understood in their historical moment. Not one word about his brother spending 10 years in prison. Not one word about his son in an abusive cult. Not one word about Manuela's death in 1951. Not one word about the price his family paid for 3 generations chasing power without moral limits. Because Carlos Salinas de Gortari learned his father's lesson perfectly. Never admit mistakes. Never show weakness. Never acknowledge that the cost was too high. But the truth is visible to anyone who looks. A man who reached the presidency of Mexico and lost everything else in the process. A man with 5 children and none of them wants to follow his steps. A man who built an empire of influence and ended up profoundly alone. The name Salinas represents the most important question any society has to ask. Is power worth it if it destroys everything else? How much success justifies losing your humanity? When does ambition turn into a generational curse that poisons your children, your grandchildren, everyone who carries your last name? Mexico never got full answers about the Swiss accounts, the drug traffickers who really ordered Ruiz Massieu's assassination. But the Salinas family has its own answers. They live them every day in the form of awkward phone calls, tense family gatherings, and the impossibility of being in one room without the ghosts of past decisions filling every silence. 3 generations, 74 years, from a 5-year-old watching a violent death to a 77-year-old ex-president living alone between 2 countries, from a cover-up in the National Palace to a family scattered across 3 continents, incapable of loving one another. That's the real curse of the Salinas. Not prison, not poverty, not public scandal, loneliness. The loneliness of people who have everything except the only thing that matters. But there's something else you need to know about how this story ends. Something the Mexican public never saw, but that defines exactly who the Salinas are when nobody's watching. In December 2019, during Christmas, the 5 Salinas Uccelli children gathered at Cecilia's house in Mexico City. It was the first time in 4 years all 5 were physically in the same room. Their father, Carlos Salinas, was not invited. According to a close friend of Ana Emilia, who was briefly there, the atmosphere was glacial. The siblings greeted each other with mechanical cheek kisses. The first 2 hours passed in safe, superficial conversation. The weather, international news, harmless anecdotes about their kids. Nobody mentioned their father. Nobody mentioned Emiliano and Nickfim. Nobody mentioned the last name they all shared. But after dinner, when the staff had left, something broke. Carlos Salinas Uccelli, the one who lives in Madrid, started talking, not directly about his father, but about a recurring dream he'd been having for 15 years. In the dream, he was a child again in Los Pinos, running through endless hallways looking for his father. The doors multiplied. Every door he opened revealed an empty room. He never found anyone. I woke up crying the first time I had that dream, Carlos said. I was 27 years old, a grown man, and I was crying like a child because even in my dreams, my father wasn't looking for me. The silence that followed was absolute. And then Emiliano spoke. For the first time since the NXIVM scandal, Emiliano spoke honestly with his siblings about why he joined that organization. Keith Raniere made me feel seen, Emiliano said. He made me feel like I mattered not because of my last name, not because of what I could accomplish, but because of who I was. And I know how pathetic that sounds. I know I became complicit in something horrible because I was desperate for validation I should have gotten from my father, and never did. Emiliano kept going. Every day I live with the guilt. Every night I think about those women who trusted me, who believed me when I told them NXIVM would change their lives. And it did change their lives. It destroyed them. And part of me got destroyed too, because I realized something. I had become him, our father, someone capable of using people like tools, someone capable of looking at suffering and rationalizing it as necessary for a greater good. Ana Emilia started crying, not quietly, but with deep sobs that had been held inside for decades. I chose to work with abused women because I am one of them, Ana Emilia said. We weren't physically beaten, but we were abused. Emotional abuse is invisible, but it destroys you the same. And the worst part is, Mexico sees us as privileged, the children of power, like we have no right to complain. But nobody sees what it was like growing up in a house where love was conditional, where every mistake was unforgivable, where showing pain was shame. Patricio, the youngest, the one who always stayed quiet, finally spoke. I live in New York because it's the only place where I can say my name without seeing that look in people's eyes. That look that says, oh, you're that Salinas' kid. You're the one who stole. You're the one who betrayed. And the most horrible part is, part of me believes I deserve that look because I carry that last name, because I benefited from that power, because I never had the courage to publicly renounce my father. The conversation lasted 4 hours. 4 hours where 5 siblings finally said the truths they'd been swallowing their entire adult lives. And at the end of that conversation, they reached a silent agreement. They would never again pretend to be a functional family. They would never again act like their childhood had been normal. And they would never again protect their father's legacy out of forced family loyalty. But the most revealing part of that night was what they didn't do. None of them called their father to confront him. None of them wrote a letter telling him those truths. None of them sought real reconciliation, because deep down they all knew something. Carlos Salinas de Gortari is incapable of giving what he never had. He can't offer emotional validation because he never received it. He can't ask for forgiveness because he was raised to never admit mistakes. He can't love unconditionally because his own father taught him love always has a price. In 2021, in an interview with an Argentine magazine, Carlos Salinas was asked about his relationship with his children. My children are independent adults with successful careers, Carlos replied. I gave them the tools to succeed in the world. That's what a father must do. The interviewer pushed. But do you have a close relationship with them? Do you see them regularly? Carlos responded with a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Closeness is measured in quality, not frequency. That answer says everything. At 77, Carlos Salinas is still incapable of admitting he failed at the only thing that truly matters, being a father. There's a video recorded in March 2023 at an economics event in Dublin. Carlos Salinas is giving a lecture on monetary policy. At the end, during Q&A, someone asks him, if you could go back in time and change one decision, what would it be? Carlos answers without hesitation. I would have implemented more aggressive structural reforms in the energy sector during my first year in office, instead of waiting until the third year. Monetary policy, structural reforms, economic strategy, not one word about Raúl, not one word about Manuela, not one word about his children, not one word about the human cost of 74 years of ambition without limits. Raúl Salinas lives differently, not better, but differently. In 2022, he was seen in a public market in Mexico City buying vegetables. A photographer recognized him and took a discreet photo. In the image, Raúl is hunched over, hair completely white, wearing modest clothes. He looks 20 years older than he is. A journalist approached him briefly and asked if he had anything to say after so many years. Raúl replied, I paid my price, 10 years in prison, my family destroyed, my name turned into a synonym for corruption. What else do you want? Blood. Then he added something the journalist remembered exactly. My brother slept peacefully all those years while I was in prison. That's the only thing you need to know about who Carlos really is. In 2024, a great niece of Manuela, the girl who died in 1951, contacted an investigative journalist. Her name is Patricia Gomez. She's 45 years old. She's a primary school teacher in Puebla. Patricia never met Manuela, but she grew up hearing the story of her great aunt who worked for a powerful family and died under strange circumstances. My grandmother, Manuela's sister, never spoke directly about what happened, Patricia said. But in her final days in 2018, she was delirious from medication and kept repeating one phrase over and over. The children knew. The children knew what they were doing. It wasn't an accident. Patricia has a photograph of Manuela, a sweet-faced girl with dark braids, smiling shyly at the camera. The photo was taken 2 months before her death. That girl was 12 years old and had her whole life ahead of her, Patricia said. And she died at the hands of children from a family so powerful her death became a footnote. Not even a proper grave. Not even justice. Just dirty money and threats until my family disappeared. Patricia has tried to get access to the official case file. Every request has been denied. The file is classified indefinitely for reasons of national security. National security era for an incident in 1951. The answer is obvious. Even now, 74 years later, the system still protects the Salinas. Because admitting the truth about Manuela would mean admitting Mexico allowed a family to build power on the corpse of a 12-year-old girl and never held anyone accountable. Today, if you search the last name Salinas on Google, millions of results appear. Economics articles, political analysis, debates about NAFTA, investigations into corruption. But almost nobody mentions Manuela. Almost nobody talks about the 5 Salinas Uccelli children who grew up without an emotionally present father. Almost nobody connects the dots between a 5-year-old witnessing violence and a 50-year-old ordering murders. Because it's easier to talk about economics than generational trauma. It's easier to analyze politics than to ask what happens when you raise children to conquer, but not to feel. The real curse of the Salinas isn't Raúl's prison sentence. It isn't Carlos's exile. It isn't Emiliano's scandal. The real curse is silence. Silence at family gatherings where nobody mentions what everyone knows. Silence from children who will never publicly say what their parents did to them. Silence from a country that chose to forget instead of confront. And that silence gets passed down. The Salinas grandchildren, the 4th generation, are already growing up with that weight. Some have legally changed their last names. Others simply avoid mentioning their family connection. None of them wants to repeat the pattern. But the pattern is already inside them. Because trauma doesn't need words to travel. It travels through awkward silences, through withheld affection, through the inability to fully trust anyone because you watched your family betray each other. This is the real story of the Salinas. Not just corruption and power, but the question we all have to ask. How much are we willing to sacrifice for our ambitions? When does success stop being worth it? When do we realize we reached the top but destroyed everything that mattered on the way up? Carlos Salinas de Gortari reached the top. He was president of Mexico. He negotiated international treaties. His name is in history books, but he is alone, deeply, irreparably alone. And that, in the end, is the cruelest curse of all.